Next news coming up at 7. Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
This hourly segment is brought to you by Papa Nicholas Coffee. Papa Nicholas, best beans, best roast, best coffee.
If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. Good op-ed, provocative at least. LA Times, two psychology professors, Gillian Peterson, psychologist and professor of criminology at Hamline University, James Densley, a sociologist and professor of criminal justice at Metropolitan State University. They did a study. They run this thing called the Violence Project. They did this study funded by the National Institute for Justice. They looked at every mass shooting since 1966, every single one. 66, I guess they start with
which one?
The University of Texas shooter.
Oh, that's right. And the bell tower there. Right.
They find four commonalities among nearly all of the mass shootings they studied. First, the vast majority of mass shooters experienced early childhood trauma, exposure to violence at a young age, parental suicide, physical or sexual abuse, neglect, domestic violence, sort of thing. Second, practically every mass shooter had reached an identifiable crisis point in the weeks or months leading up to the shooting. Specific grievance was the trigger that moved them to action. Such crisis, they also add, were in many cases communicated to others through a marked change in behavior, an expression of suicidal thoughts or plans, specific threats of violence. Well, I mean, look, in the case of the Dayton shooter, specific threats of violence dating back to when he was a freshman in high school in 2010.
Yeah, he had a rape list for girls and a kill list for boys. And everybody knew he was out of his mind.
The third point of commonality, most shooters have studied the actions of other shooters and sought validation for their motives. Sure, they need a cause. Fourth, the shooters all had the means to carry out their plans. Once someone decides life is no longer worth living and that murdering others would be a proper revenge, only means and opportunities stand in the way of another mass shooting. And so they start to ask very rational questions. This ubiquitous use of the term mental illness. Very rational questions. Is the site accessible? Can I get firearms? 80% of the school shootings, perpetrators got their weapons from family members, according to the data here. Workplace shooters tended to use handguns they legally owned. Other public shooters are more likely to acquire them illegally, but not exclusively, of course, we know from examples in the not-too-distant past. Very interesting data for informing public policy. They recommend a couple of steps. One, deprive potential shooters of the means to carry out their plans, including making potential shooting sites less accessible with visible security measures, metal detectors, police officers. But potential shooting sites would be, what isn't a potential shooting site? Wherever people gather.
Right. The
So
list goes on and on.
So that sounds good. It's a little bit more complicated to implement and costly. Not every institution that where people congregate can afford visible security measures, metal detectors, police officers, harden the target, so to speak. Another step is to make it more difficult for potential perpetrators to find validation for their planned actions. Media campaigns like #NoNotoriety are helping starve perpetrators of the oxygen of publicity, and technology companies are increasingly being held accountable for facilitating mass violence. But what else? So going back to basics here, the beginnings, what else in terms of family and raising children? We've seen in almost all of these cases, you've got a family that is not your intact nuclear family. You had the El Paso shooter whose dad came out, he wrote a memoir about it, in fact, that he was a drug abuser for 40 years.
That's why he was mostly raised by his grandparents, who came out and said that he was Christian. But then the mom in this case did the right thing. Mom called police and said, my son bought an assault rifle, AK-47, and I don't feel comfortable. But he didn't even have an unpaid parking ticket.
Well,
and he was 21 years old, and there's no
hold
history
on.
of mental illness.
Hold on. The mom call, this is actually an important point. The mom call, number one, didn't identify. Number two, she didn't say there was imminent threat of violence. She said, I have a son who bought an AK and I'm uncomfortable with it. What should I do? Here's the thing. How did we get to that point with that family? Where mom can't discuss that with son, mom has to involve law enforcement. That doesn't seem to me like a mother-son relationship that's particularly strong. That seems to me like an indicator of a problem there, right? So it was like the way this was reported last week. Wait a second. If you have a relationship with your kid, who's still a young man, he was of age, but he's still a young man, you would have that discussion with him, wouldn't you? Involving police seems to me an indication of fear or whatever, but something has broken down in that family.
Well, he was raised by his grandparents mostly because his dad was a drug addict. And then look at the shooter himself. He looks more Hispanic than Hispanic people that I know. And he drives, 10 hours in a car to shoot.
What does this Hispanic have to do anything with it?
Because he was trying to stop a Hispanic invasion of the United States of America. Okay.
Well, I understand.
I mean, he's crazy, and people are saying, oh, he's a Republican, Democrat. No, he's in the party of crazy and mentally ill. That's what party he belongs to.
Well, again, this is the loose use of the term mental illness, the phrase mental illness. If you read his quote-unquote manifesto, it's not particularly compelling, but it doesn't smack of mental illness. In point of fact, more and more what we see that we're having a difficult time grappling with, we've talked about this all the time, evil exists in the world. We focus on the instrumentality. We want to say somebody's just sick. They couldn't, of sound mind, choose to do these horrific acts. And you know what? They can. And it's happened. And it's happened again. And the thing that's the most disquieting is you can't get to how somebody can be so desensitized and indifferent to other life that they would commit an act like this. So we say mental illness, or we focus on instrumentality. And I think we need to look a little deeper than that. And to help us do that, we're pleased to be joined again by Leonard Sachs, who is an MD, PhD, and also best-selling author of a number of books that you should read if you haven't. I particularly Boys Adrift, but he's written on both sexes. Boys Adrift, Girls on the Edge, two of his books, Why Gender Matters, and the New York Times bestseller, The Collapse of Parenting. Dr. Sachs, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
So what about that? What's your sort of first focus when it comes to thinking about what happened in El Paso and Dayton last week?
I've actually been writing about this for 20 years.
Yeah.
I first wrote about this after the Columbine shooting in 1999. I wrote about what I called the unspeakable pleasure. There have always been young men who enjoy killing, who enjoy seeing other humans suffer and die. That's as old as Cain. Genesis chapter 4. God says to Cain, sin is crouching at the door, but you must rule over it. So why are we seeing this rise in the number of men who are taking guns and killing lots of people who they don't know? And I trace it to this phenomenon that has really poisoned American culture. Whatever floats your boat. If it feels good, do it. Young Americans are now immersed in a culture that they find in YouTube and online, which is all about, hey, you do you, whatever feels good, whatever feels right. No recognition that there is this warped nature that we all struggle with. We all have to deal with the temptation to do evil. And if you take a man who has that temptation in him and then you immerse him in a culture that says, you do you, whatever floats your boat. If it feels good, do it. You're going to see more and more men shooting other people because, hey, that's what floats my boat.
Well, what's
That's
the
what I most want
yeah.
to do. That's how I find my meaning.
Well, what's the parent's responsibility in all of this?
So again, I keep coming back to Deuteronomy 6. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart. And what's the next line? Usually translated, you teach them diligently to your children. That's actually not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew word there is shanan, which means to chisel in stone. So a better translation of Deuteronomy 6:7 would be incise them, inscribe them in the hearts of your children. So that's in my book, The Collapse of Parenting. On the next page, I cite a New York Times columnist, Jennifer Finney Boylan, who says enlightened parenting means setting your child free to discover for themselves their own right and wrong, and if in so doing they become a stranger to you, then so be it, end quote. Many parents are letting their sons play violent video games, surf YouTube, with no recognition that this is forming your child's character. Turn off the screen. Strengthen the parent-child bond. Teach your son.
Now,
Do not kill. Do
Yeah.
unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's a command. And, I have witnessed firsthand the collapse of American parenting. As recently as 20 years ago, American parents would say, do unto others. But over the last 20 years, I've seen that command soften into a question. And the question is often something like, well, how would you feel if someone did that to you? And the parents have no response when their son says, if someone did that to me, I'd kick him in the nuts and then I'd sit on his face. This fundamentally is a symptom of something very sick in our culture, of parents' failure to teach right and wrong authoritatively to their kids.
We had a very similar conversation the week before last in the wake of the Gilroy Garlic Festival shooting, because it was reported that a witness asked the shooter, "Why are you doing this?" And he said, "Because I'm really angry." And so our conversation, very much in keeping with you, and partly because I've read your work, is the idea of unrestrained indulgence of emotion. I'm angry, and so I'm entitled to do this because who is anybody to say that I'm not? Who has the moral standing to tell me what I'm doing is right or wrong? I make up the decision myself. Truth comes from my head, and then everybody operates in the same way. But I hear you say something a bit nuanced, and I want to point it out, make sure I have it right. Because, of course, everybody wants to isolate the thing. This is the thing. Violent video games is the thing. Guns are the thing. Bullying was the thing. And what I hear you saying is the thing that ties all of those sort of symptoms together is this unrestrained indulgence of emotion, the living my truth, for lack of a better phrase. And that encapsulates violent video games and other drug use and other antisocial and destructive behavior.
Yeah, I think that's right. You go back to Columbine 20 years ago, the first news that came out was, oh, these boys were victims of bullying. That turned out not to be true. Eyewitnesses to Columbine 20 years ago said that Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris were like orgasmic, quote unquote. They were laughing. They were enjoying themselves. They were taking great pleasure in shooting other students and watching the students crumple and die. Again, there's always been some men who enjoy inflicting pain, who get satisfaction out of that. That's nothing new. That's as old as Cain. What's new is that parents no longer are raising their kids with strong moral guardrails. The guardrails have been broken. And when the guardrails are broken, there are some young men who are going to careen off the edge and take up a gun and kill because it feels right.
And we want to, and it's fun because it's not fun. It's fun in a sort of a sixth sense. It's the idea that listening to the discourse of from politics and the press corps in the wake of this. It's all about these binaries about guns, or these binaries about red flag laws, mental illness, committing, and so on and so forth. we want to talk all around the issue because we don't want to confront the truth. And it reminds me of this phrase that just keeps recurring in my head when we talk about American culture, from the Roman historian Livy, where we're at a place where we can neither endure our vices nor their cures. So
Yeah.
we can't endure
Well,
the mass
indeed,
shootings, but we won't do the central thing.
well, the events of last week, I think, really drove home that politics. Look, you had one shooter who's Elizabeth Warren supporter, very left of center in Dayton, and another shooter who claims to be right of center in El Paso. And it was really a teachable moment. Hey, this is not primarily about politics. These are about young men using politics as an excuse to indulge their desire to kill. And you will find this across the political spectrum. And it's a smokescreen and a confusion to say that this is about politics. It is not. It's about culture. It's about our failure to install strong moral guardrails and a sense that no matter how upset I am, I have no right to take a gun and shoot another person who I don't even know.
When you read the details of the lives of these young men, their family lives, how much culpability do you place on the parents, particularly when you have, in the case of the Dayton shooter, warning signs for the better part of a decade?
Well, I think that's a temptation that we have to say, well, this couldn't happen in my community. This can happen in my family. There have always been bad parents. There have always been neglectful parents. That's also not new. But what is new is that these unfortunate young men are now taking up guns and killing other people who they don't know in mass shootings. And that is becoming much more common. 20 years ago, Columbine was the worst event of its time in history. Now it doesn't rank in the top 10. So we're seeing an acceleration in the number and severity of these mass killings. And that cannot be blamed, I think, on bad parenting. Parents are spending more time with their kids on average now than they were 20 years ago. That's well documented on average. But the rise in the frequency and severity of these events, I think, is telling us there's something wrong with the culture, that we've got more and more kids who are sitting in their bedroom alone, looking at a screen, looking at chat pages and YouTube videos without parents' involvement, without parents'